Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We're proud to have Michael DePalma on the call. Michael is with Datto, one of the Scarlet Group's business partners. And, the topic really is ransomware and, how to recover from it. And this is very pertinent to the construction industry. We have probably 70% of our clients are in the AEC construction industries. And we're seeing more and more activity with ransomware, as you probably are yourselves. So without further ado, Michael, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. So my name is Mike DePalma, Channel Development Manager with Datto. So we are a backup and disaster recovery company. We're based out of Norwalk, Connecticut, so about 40 miles east of Manhattan. I actually come from the construction management industry. I've been with Datto about 4.5 years, but prior to that, I spent about 8.5 years with a construction management company called Gilbane. You might have heard of us. We did, do a lot of public works, schools and hospitals and all that. So as we go through this, I could really give some real life stories because I lived in that world for several years. So quickly, overview of Datto. Founded in 2007 for the business owners or entrepreneurs on the call. It's a pretty cool story. Our founder started the company when he was 22. Started building these backup devices by hand and selling them online, and you fast forward to 2015, so 8 years later, the Wall Street Journal gave us a $1 billion valuation. So we're actually the only unicorn company in the state of Connecticut. So now we're up over 1,400 employees worldwide, and we protect in our private data centers over 450 petabytes of data. It's one of the largest private clouds in the world. So a lot of people hear the word cloud, they're thinking that the public clouds, the AWSs, Azure and all that. We actually control both of our US data centers. We do have 9 data centers around the world. I do a lot of presentations up in Canada, and you'll be interested to know the first question I always get is, are you sending our data down to the States? Because for whatever reason, the Canadians aren't too trustworthy about us or our government. So the answer is no. We've got 2 data centers up there. But the point of that is, we want to keep the data in the country wherever it originates in. So even our data centers over in Europe, we try to keep all of the data within that geographical area. So I'll get into the reasons why we chose our locations in the States in a little bit. So when we look at some of these cybersecurity threats, what are they targeting? What industries are they targeting? Construction, manufacturing industries are the most targeted industries that we're seeing, especially with the ransomware attacks. And they're exploiting a lot of different things. Obviously, you want to have a multi-layered approach to combat these things. So it starts with your firewalls and anti-intrusion procedures and all the rest. But ultimately, the last line of defense is your backup solution. And these criminals know that for the most part, every business, every industry, you're backing up your data in some form or fashion. That being said, most folks are still using the same types of backup they were using 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Whereas everything else within the IT industry has evolved and companies understand that, they still are kind of in the antiquated way of backing up their data, whether it's an external hard drive or maybe they are sending it to the cloud, which is great. You've got a second copy of your data, different geographical locations, but there are limitations to all these traditional kind of commoditized forms of backup. First and foremost are just the higher failure rates. If you're still using tape backup, which you still are, I was just in Kansas City earlier this week, and I had a couple people in the crowd still using tape backups. You go spend a few minutes looking up online some of the failure rates of that, or some of the, again, commoditized backup solutions, you'll see they're going to be higher failure rates, right? They're made to get out into mass production and get as much out as possible, kind of more designed for the residential side than the commercial side. The manual aspect is key as well. If I've been in this space again 4.5 years, I could tell you without a doubt, the biggest cause of data loss and downtime is user error. When we're talking about ransomware, normally what they're doing is they're going to have a spear phishing attack where they're going to get somebody to open that door and let them in by clicking on a link or clicking on an attachment and downloading that. So then it comes back to your backups. Who's taking those backups? Is there somebody responsible for that? And then who's testing those backups? That's the question that most people cannot answer. How often are you testing those backups? The criminals love that because they know, yeah, these folks think that they're safe. They're backing up their data. Now we've gone and we've encrypted it via ransomware. Go ahead and try to restore it. And that's when they find out that, yes, we haven't been testing it and maybe we are having some failure rates. Now, the biggest piece of leverage they have is the slow recovery time. So what ransomware is doing is they're holding your data for hostage, essentially. And you give 2 options, okay? You're either going to pay this ransom or you're going to recover from a backup. Now, for the most part, if you're trying to pull data back from an external hard drive, or if you do have it in the cloud, that's going to take several days to get all the data back and get truly into a production environment. They know that. That's their big piece of leverage, because they know the cost of that downtime is going to far exceed the cost of the actual ransom payment. And then lastly, just the risk of infection or theft. This is pretty simple. If you've got one form of backup and it's on your site, or somebody in your team brings it home every weekend, you run the risk of that data being lost or it's stolen. And even if it is encrypted, the bottom line is that data is now gone. So I've been given ransomware specific presentations now for about 4 years. And 4 years ago, you'd get some head nods, a lot of people in the audience kind of looking down at their phones, that type of thing. But as the years have gone on, now you see a lot more head nods. You see folks that have either been attacked, or a competitor in their industry, or a vendor or client has been attacked. And now you get to see that a lot of folks are at least aware of the threat that is ransomware. But back in May of 2017, we saw the largest single day attack from a single virus ever, and that was this WannaCry attack. It was a single virus that in a single day was able to impact 220,000 networks worldwide. 150 countries were impacted. So now it was on the front page of every paper, lead story on every website, right? And so I was doing a presentation about 2 weeks later, and I was alongside a gentleman from the FBI in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And at the time, when we were kind of analyzing this attack, right, first and foremost, we're trying to figure out what vulnerabilities were exploited. We also wanted to see, okay, well, what did they actually net from this? And what was interesting was they only asked for $300 in ransom across the board. Now, normally what these criminals try to do is they do a little bit of research on your company, the size of your company, the industry, all of those type of things, so that they know how much to ask for, right? They want to ask for just enough where you can actually pay it without leaving any money on the table. So if they hit a Fortune 500 company, they know they've hit the jackpot and they could ask for 6 or 7 figures. If it's a small one-man nonprofit, maybe they can get $800 out of them and move on. This virus didn't try to do any of that. It's $300 across the board. It could have been a large bank, a municipality, or that one-man shop, and it was only $300. So they only netted $300,000 worldwide. That might seem like a large number. It's really just a small fraction. About $1 billion changed hands in last year alone between the business community and these criminals. So in our mind, in the IT space, we said, okay, this is just phase one. They had this cool new tool. They can go and really blast it out to a lot of companies all at once. The next phase, phase two, is going to be, we're going to figure out how to monetize it, right? So that's my presentation in front of this group. The FBI agent comes up after me and he starts talking about some really scary stuff, cyber warfare, hacktivism, those type of things. But he finishes with ransomware because it's the hot button topic of the day, right? He says, we actually have 2 theories here at the FBI. One is exactly what Michael said. This is phase one. We're preparing for phase two through figuring out what those vulnerabilities are, trying to patch those up, trying to educate the community. That's why they were out there doing this seminar. But they had a second theory, and at the time, the second theory seemed pretty far-fetched to me. But as the months went on, there seemed to be a lot of validity behind it. The second theory said that what their goal really wasn't to gather those dollars from the ransom payments. That $300,000 they got was just gravy. Second theory said that they knew this was going to be worldwide news. They knew this was going to be the lead story on every news site, right? So what they were trying to do was scare the world into doing one thing, and that was buying Bitcoin. Now remember, this is May of 2017. A lot of people weren't really thinking about Bitcoin. But these criminals have been really ramping up these ransomware attacks since about 2013. And 99% of the time, they're asking for the money in Bitcoin, which is an anonymous cryptocurrency, kind of created with this utopian idea that we're going to have this currency that is, because of its anonymity, governments can't come in and inflate it or deflate it. It truly was going to rise and fall based on market factors. But the anonymity of it really drove all the criminals to it, and that's why they saw them on the dark web using it to buy drugs and guns and all the rest. But they were asking for these ransom payments in Bitcoin because they knew they weren't going to get caught. So they're not going to ask you for your credit card, and they're not going to ask you to wire money. You're going to ask you to set up a Bitcoin account and pay them. So they've been collecting these Bitcoins by the millions when a Bitcoin was $50, $100. And you could see on this chart, it was pretty much stagnant for a long time. And, opened up 2016, it was about $440. It opened up 2017, it was just under $1,000. And then you see that first spike. And when was that first spike? That was late May, early June of 2017. Because what you saw happen was that these companies all over the world, a lot of large companies, started gobbling up Bitcoin because they were listening to the IT community, folks like me, telling them that phase two was coming. And yes, they were making investments into ways to try to make sure that they didn't get hit and that they were able to recover. They knew their last line of defense is, hey, we need to have this Bitcoin because we can't be down for a week as all of our systems are trying to be recovered. And it's not like you walk into your Wells Fargo bank and say, hey, I need $100,000 in Bitcoin. You've got to set up an account. You've got to find an exchange and fund that. I could tell you that at Datto, there's 4 of us that do what I do and kind of go around and do these seminars, and they gave us a Bitcoin account and funded it with just $100 just so we could talk about it intelligently and get the email saying the funding is on the way. And it took 6 days to get that money to hit my account. By the time it got there, it was only worth $87. And so these companies were trying to make sure they were prepared for that. And so what happens? The markets followed, and you saw that crazy bonanza back in 2017 of Q4, and you saw it go skyrocket. It actually peaked at close to $20,000 for a Bitcoin, and it opened up last year at $15,000. Now it's down in the $3,000-$4,000 range, but you would see those stories, right, of that 19-year-old kid who bought some Bitcoin when he was 16 and now he's a millionaire, or the savvy investor who knew cryptocurrency was going to explode. But the reality is the folks that were making hundreds of millions of dollars in Q4 of 2017 were the criminals who had been gobbling up all this Bitcoin for years. And so whether that FBI theory was right or wrong, the fact of the matter remains that these criminals made billions, to be honest with you, over the course of those 4 months as that crazy buying market occurred. And then we saw the big sell-off, and there's a theory that now all the criminals just cashed it out. And so that, when we look at ransomware specifically, it's been around 30 years. And we've seen some variants pop up. This screen shows you the more prevalent variants. 2013, we saw this spike. What happened then? Well, that was the invention of Bitcoin and kind of the marriage between those two. And so the construction industry was particularly vulnerable. We saw that. We saw story after story of this particular attack that we read the stories again about the municipalities and police departments and all those that were hit because that's a sensational story. But the construction industry was hit more than any other industry, and that came from study after study. And why was that? Well, they've got data that they know is valuable to you. The genius behind ransomware isn't that they're going and stealing your data. It's that they're encrypting it. So it doesn't mean they need to go out and hit a bank because that data is super valuable. They want to attack the industries who are most tied to it and need to get that data back because they know that they will pay. And so think about the data that all construction industries, whatever kind of space you're in, you've got your employer information, you've got construction data, right? The actual plans. If you're doing any public work, this data is now auditable. So you've got to have access to all those plans, right? Owner data, whoever you're working with, you've got a lot of their data. You know that you need to be able to get that back. And then obviously just data about your company itself. And so that's what makes the construction industry very valuable. Within this article I have pulled up, and really wherever you're going to get your news and you look for tips and pitfalls and all the rest, they're pretty much the same. First and foremost, you want to secure your systems. That kind of goes without saying. Educating your personnel, the most important thing you could do, the first line of defense, goes back to the fact that I told you, the user error is the leading cause of this data loss and downtime. These ransomware attacks, for the most part, are coming in via an email. It looks like every other email in your inbox. You're going to get somebody asleep at the wheel to click on it. So education is key. It should be an ongoing thing. It's not one training session and say, okay, we're going to talk to you in 5 years. It should be ongoing. That's why hopefully you could take this webinar and share it with the rest of your team. And most importantly, creating that plan. Creating that plan that says, okay, the fire alarm goes off in your building, everybody knows what to do. If you get that scary red screen that says, pay me my ransom, does everybody in your company know what to do? I could tell you when I was at my last employer and I clicked on a button and executed a ransomware file that I want to go walk down the hall and talk to the project executive and say, hey, I think I just encrypted our server with ransomware. Probably not. Probably going to try to handle it on my own. Right? I'm pretty technical. I could fix this. Or talk to my buddy down the hall. Hey, can you come in here and fix this? You got to know when you get that scary red screen, what do you have to do? How do I isolate the machine? Who do I call? Creating that plan is key because it'll help mitigate that risk of it, kind of expanding out. And so, I kind of want to take a pause here, Tom, and see if you've got any real life examples. I know you've got a lot of experience in this space. What kind of examples do you have, real life, about these type of attacks specific to this industry?
Yeah, Mike, like I said, over 70% of our clients are in the AEC, in the construction industry, and we deal with it every day. But, one that comes to mind was several years ago. It was an early onboarding of a relatively new client. And, they had about 500 employees, and I think they had 70 servers, and we were in the early part of the engagement, and so we had deployed Datto to only a certain segment of their population. And lo and behold, somebody clicked on an email, and they ended up encrypting their hard drives or the drives, and the recovery for the Datto was almost instantaneous. But the areas that weren't backed up by Datto, that were backed up by really another more legacy type backup environment, it took them about a week to recover from that, and they were lucky they were able to recover. So yeah, we deal with it every day on the front end and the back end. You're absolutely right. Training on the front end is critical, but you got to be prepared because humans are humans and error happens. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, technology is built to work, but it's relying upon, employees and folks to do the right thing, and we've all made those mistakes. Right? We have training. I work for a disaster recovery company. We have ongoing training all the time. We have our team send out spear phishing attacks to us to see if we'll click on it. And if we click on it, we get a little screen that pops up and says, congratulations, you've just been enrolled in a 1-hour training session. So everybody should be worried about it. But as we look at this ransomware attacks, right, I mentioned that $1 billion number. It's a huge amount of number, and that's dollars that actually changed hands. But the actual impact to the business community in North America alone was over $75 billion last year. So what makes up that gap, right? What makes up that remaining $74 billion? Well, that's because that number includes the cost of data loss and the cost of downtime, the true impact to the business community, right? That's the ripple effects are far greater than the actual payments. So I know you can get acronym to death on any kind of, technology webinar, right? But there's two that you should be able to answer. Everybody on the call should be able to go back and answer. And they're going to be different for everybody on the call, but you have to make sure that you can answer these questions and they're aggressive enough for you. And the first one is that left-hand side of the screen. Your RPO is what your recovery point objective is. How much data are you at risk of losing at any given time based on whatever kind of backup solution you have? It's a pretty simple question to answer. How often am I taking my backups? Now, the only caveat to that is, if you're not testing your backups, you can't answer that question, because you could say, hey, we back up every day, that's great, and then you go to restore from a backup, you find out that you've been failing for the last 3 weeks, now that star jumps from 1 day to 3 weeks. But for the most part, folks feel pretty comfortable about it, right? That's the first piece of leverage these guys have, these criminals have. They've got your data. If you're not backing up your data, you're not testing it, there's no way you have any other recourse but to pay this ransom, right? But for the most part, businesses are backing up their data, which is great. But the second point of leverage that they have is the RTO side, your recovery time objective. How much downtime would you incur if your systems were to go down? And that's for any reason, whether it is a cyber attack, whether it's a hardware failure, whether it's a storm, a fire, a flood, tornado, hurricane, any of these type of things. How long would you be down for before you're back up into a true production environment? And is that aggressive enough? Most folks can't answer that question. Most folks can't tell me, A, how long it would take them, and then try to put a dollar value on that and say, man, how much would it cost us to be down for a week, beyond the fact that am I losing, future bids because of it, I'm getting on some sort of blacklist, all those type of things. So those are the two pieces of leverage. And the reason why most folks pay is that right-hand side of the screen, because they're given that math equation. Okay, am I going to pay my $5,000 in ransom, or am I going to be down for a week? The cost of that downtime is going to far exceed it. And I'll give you a couple examples. But before that, I want to take a step back and just talk about who's behind these attacks, right? Who are we up against? It's not the guy in his basement anymore doing these attacks so he doesn't have to get a real job, or he wants to go brag on the dark web about how smart he is. You see that story. This is what criminal enterprises, this is what organized crime has shifted to here in the States, out in Eastern Europe and Russia and China, because there's so much money to be made with so little risk of getting caught. And unfortunately, the best and the brightest in the technology space are moving towards the dark side because there's so much money to be made. Now, you might have heard last year that the greatest casino heist of all time was perpetrated. It didn't make the kind of news you think it would, right? Because you'd think it'd be this sensational story you see in the movies with the guys sneaking through the HVAC ducts or putting on, costumes and sneaking in. That's not how crime is done anymore. What these criminals were able to do was able to find a vulnerability. And that vulnerability was in the internet-connected fish tank thermometer of this casino. Internet of Things. Everybody hears this. Everything's connected, right? They found out that this was not secure and it was connected to the internet. They were able to hack in, and what they were able to do, once they got into that system, they were able to steal all the personal information from the high rollers of that casino. This is information that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the dark web. Because you can go and it's almost like an exchange once you get on that dark web and you say, okay, I've got a 55-year-old male. He's got $7 million in his bank account. Here's his social security number. Here's his address. I'll sell it to you for $100,000. And now that person who did the actual hack, they wipe their hands clean and they're on to the next one. And then the next phase comes in. Somebody tries to figure out how to monetize that information. There really is a corporate structure behind it. So it's scary stuff. This is who we're up against. And I'm doing another presentation up in the city, up in New York City, earlier last year. And again, this time I had to follow the FBI agent. So he actually stole one of my stories, so I had to adjust on the fly. But he was given some really, again, scary stuff. FBI agents want to scare you. And so as he's giving his presentation, all of a sudden he stops and he shows a picture of a house. And he says, anybody recognize this house? Now, this is a room of 200, 250 people, and everybody's kind of looking at each other. And a guy in the back of the room says, hey, that's my house. And now everybody looks up and he goes, that's a beautiful house, sir. And you know what? You just got a promotion at work a couple weeks ago. Congratulations. Spends a minute trying to just start rattling off all these facts about this guy in the back of the room. And now he's got the room's attention. He stops and he says, okay, I bet you think I use all the tools at my disposal to gather this information about this guy, right? I'm in the FBI. I got all the tools necessary. It's not what I did at all. What I did was I talked to the organizer of the event. I got a list of registrants and I picked one of you at random. And all I had was your name and your employer. That was what was on the list. And what I did was I found you on LinkedIn, right? Found all your information on LinkedIn. I found now I know what you look like, so I went and found you on Facebook. That's where I got this beautiful picture of your house. And then I looked for you on Twitter and Instagram, and in 10 minutes I had a good sense of who you were, right? So what am I going to do? Now, this particular gentleman graduated from Penn State. That's a great university. It also has one of the largest and strongest alumni associations in the world. So my first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pick on the low-hanging fruit. I'm going to create an email that looks exactly like every other email you've gotten from this alumni association. You probably get them all the time. And it's going to come out and it's going to say, click here, a little hyperlink that says, click here to download all the information you need for our 20-year reunion festivities. And you're going to click on it because it looks like every other email that you've gotten. If that doesn't work, I'm going to work my way down your LinkedIn profile, find some coworkers, maybe figure out who your boss is, maybe a previous employer, create an email account that looks like it's coming from them. And one of these days, it's going to be a Friday afternoon. You're trying to clean up your inbox before the weekend. I'm going to get you asleep at the wheel. You're going to click on that link, and now I've got you. And so when you hear the phrase socially engineered spear phishing attack, this is what it is. There's so much information that we readily provide to the internet on all these social media sites that a criminal can go in and figure out who you are, who your company is, and get that email that goes out. It's no longer the email from your long-lost uncle saying, send me $10,000 and I'll leave you $1 million in my will, or the Nigerian prince or any of that stuff. Nobody's falling for that. They're doing these type of attacks so that email looks like every other email in your inbox, and you've probably seen them. In the last 2 days, I got one from PayPal telling me to go update my account, and I got one from Wells Fargo saying they double charged me, go log in there. It looked fishy to me because I live in this space. I didn't click on it, and rightly so. It was it was a criminal attack. And so, back to ransomware. We see the stories, and this is actually one of the problems. We see the stories about the large attacks. That's what gets sensationalized. That's why a lot of companies in other industries don't feel like it's happening to them, because they see the stories about folks like the city of Atlanta. They were hit with ransomware last year, and it made, again, big news. And what was interesting about this attack was, it's going to highlight a lot of what I've been talking about, but they were asked for $52,000. For the city of Atlanta, that's not a huge ask, but the policy is we don't deal with terrorist organizations like this holding you hostage, so they didn't want to pay it. Within a couple weeks, an article comes out that says they had paid, the actual impact was $2.7 million to remediate this and try to hire outside consultants and try to get their systems back. I mean, they had the police department couldn't get access to their database, and they're writing handwritten citations and filing them in folders. And so the impact was far greater than that ask. They had to go to the city a few months later and ask for another $9.5 million. So now this attack, this $52,000 ransom attack, had a total impact of over $12 million. So when you go back to that $75 billion number, where does that come from? It comes from things like this. And these are huge numbers. They're almost hard to relate to. But I could tell you this, the entire IT budget for the city of Atlanta is $35 million. A third of it went towards this single attack. So these are the type of impacts that we're talking about. Now, at Datto, we've had now 3 years running, we do our own ransomware report, largest in the industry, ransomware specific. And we interview two groups of people, the managed services community, right? So folks like Tom's team, and then the small business community to get some real data, not rely on third-party data. So we talk to folks directly. And what we found was no industry was safe. I mentioned it when we talked to these folks, these managed service providers. 38% of them had a client in the construction and manufacturing field hit with ransomware specifically. Every single industry was hit. So when you see the stories, again, the big sensational stories, the police departments, the hospitals, the news picks those up, right? Because that's a sensational story. But the fact of the matter is every industry is vulnerable. And again, the reason goes back to ransomware in general. They know they can cast this huge net because they know that every industry needs their data, specifically the construction industry. And so they know that they're more apt to pay. And the problem with trying to really pinpoint a lot of these numbers is that less than a quarter of the small businesses that were attacked reported it to authorities. And there's two reasons for that. One, they know the FBI is not going to investigate anything. The FBI doesn't put out official stats on it, but I could tell you that they won't even look at anything under a $100,000 ask. And I've heard that the number is actually closer to $250,000. So yeah, they want you to report it, but they're not going to put any resources into catching these guys or getting your data back. And the other reason is you don't want to report it. Do you want to be the company in your space, in your industry that's been makes news that you've been hit with ransomware? Even though your data wasn't stolen, do you want that reputation hit? So no, most people try to handle it in-house because your competitors are going to use that against you and say, hey, did you see those guys get it? Do you read that story? They're going to forward it to potential owners that they're talking to. And so that's what we're up against. But we also saw, again, that cost of downtime far exceeding the ransom payment. The average ransom payment was just over $4,000. The impact, 10 times higher than that, right? $46,000 per attack for a small business. So that's the reason why people are paying. So what's the government doing about it? They do what they do best. They're going to investigate first. They're not going to catch many of these guys, especially on the small business side. They're going to educate. That's why you see a lot more of these folks going around and doing presentations and those type of things, which is great. And then they do what they do best. They regulate, right? We're up here in the Northeast. We get regulated to death. But if you're doing any work with anybody overseas, you're already compliant. You have to be compliant with GDPR, really the broadest regulation out there in terms of user data. And so we're seeing that kind of sweep through the states. And here in the States, it's a state-by-state kind of way of doing things, or industry by industry. But we're seeing places like California essentially enact GDPR 2.0. And eventually, everyone's going to have to be compliant to something very similar. But what are these regulations really doing? They're not helping to catch any of these guys. They're really not helping to stop any of these guys from making these attacks happen. What they're really doing is they're shifting that burden onto the business and saying it's your responsibility to make sure you're doing your due diligence to protect your data and your client's data. And so that's putting that fear of, hey, not only do I have to worry about being attacked and having the downtime and all of the rest, but even if I do recover all of that, now I've got fines and regulation compliance issues coming down as well. So that's really what we're seeing, and some scary stuff, right? So another kind of reason why you need to have a third party come and look at it. Wherever I go, you look at tips and tricks and all these different types of things. All industries kind of wind up being the same type thing, kind of reiterating that article earlier. Keeping your operating system software up to date. That goes without saying. Password audits. This is something very simple, right? Multi-factor authentication. Making sure that your passwords are safe. The most common password in America right now is password 1234. And it'll take a hacker less than 2 seconds to get through that. Employee training, we talked about, very critical. Backing up your critical files, obviously kind of goes without saying. And then, again, most importantly, having that cyber attack recovery plan. Who does what? What do I do when I get that scary screen? So how do you go about really combating this downtime? This is what we keep talking about, the downtime. Where could Tom and his team come in and really help out in this regard? Well, backing up your data a little differently than the traditional form of backup, but in terms of business continuity, not just keeping your backup safe, but actually keeping your business up and running. So there's a couple things that differentiate traditional backup from business continuity. One, the hybrid approach, having an on-premise backup, but also replicating to multiple data centers in different geographical locations. I mentioned, we've got 9 around the world. Here in the States, we have 2, one in Reading, Pennsylvania, one in Salt Lake City, Utah. What's the reason for that? Well, we want to make sure they're as far apart as possible, because if you've got just a server failure or an attack, you've got that on-premise data, that's great. The Gartner put out a study last year, and the lead quote from it was, whatever you're buying and selling in the technology space, assume that it fails. What happens next? So, okay, your server goes down, we've got this on-premise backup. What happens if this on-premise backup is compromised? Okay, great. Got a second copy of your data up in Reading, Pennsylvania. All right, let's go with doomsday scenario. Whatever's happening down in your area is also impacting Reading, Pennsylvania. Get that third copy of your data in different on the other side of the country. So again, on-premise and then multiple copies in different geographical locations. So no matter what's going on around you, regardless of what's happening, you've got access to a clean copy of your data. You also want to take that user error out of it. We talked about that RPO number. How often do I need to take backups? Well, instead of relying upon somebody to actually do that, you would work with the team and say, okay, what's my schedule? I back up hourly in my workstation, and I back up, that's during work hours, and then a couple times a day on the weekends. So you set that schedule up for as aggressive as you need it to be. But those backups are all being tested automatically, both locally and that off-site sync occurred. And maybe you get an X on one of those, and it's not that pretty green circle. Well, now you can at least be proactive about it, and you can Tom and his team come in and say, okay, well, what happened here? Let's make sure we remediate this so that you're not finding out that your backups failed after an attack, right? And taking, again, that user error out of it and being proactive. Now, the way that backup is taken nowadays is different than those traditional forms of backup. Used to be, really, it was just a machine that would back up whatever files and folders you're telling it to do. And for the most part, it did exactly what you asked for. Now, you might have missed a volume because that device was not backing up certain volumes, but for the most part, that's what it did. Image-based backup actually does things a little bit differently. It actually takes a snapshot of that entire server, not just the files and folders, but also the operating systems, the applications. Literally everything that lives on that server now is replicated to that on-premise device, subsequently sent off to those data centers. So just on the restoration process, when you're talking about the downtime, think about if you've got a file level backup and that server is gone and you need to replace it. Well, before you could even start bringing those files over, you've got to install the operating system, all your applications, and then you're ready to start migrating over that data. And again, you're using cloud data, you've got several terabytes up in the cloud. That's going to be several days, if not weeks, to bring all that back on and get a true production environment. Image-based, again, does it a little differently. You've already got all of that information, including the operating system. So we do what's called the bare metal restore and bring all of that data over all at once. So that new server, that new piece of hardware is going to look and feel exactly like your old piece of hardware. And what it also allows us to do is we've got what's called inverse chain technology. So once that initial backup is taken and everything that lives on that server has been backed up, you set up that schedule that we talked about before, and all we're doing is backing up the incremental block level changes, which allows us to say every one of these backups is independent of one another. Traditional backups tend to be layered upon previous backups. This means that no matter what's happening, there's no risk of those previous backups being impacted. So you get hit with ransomware at 11 o'clock, you take that time machine back to 10 a.m., and you could be back up and running from that. There's no risk of those previous backups being impacted. So that's critical. And that could go from just, regular deletions. You can go back in time. But ultimately, the way to combat this is through virtualization. And what virtualization means is, since everything that lived on that server, this represents your server, you get that scary red screen. Before you even start figuring out when the restoration needs to occur and all the rest, you call up Tom and his team, and he would spin up a virtual machine right from that on-premise device. Now, this would be operating as your server. Everyone in the office, everyone in your trailer is going to be able to work directly off of this server, this data device. Most folks won't even know that it has failed over to this, and it's a true production environment. It's not just giving you access to the files and folders. It's allowing you to make changes to those, saving those, right? So you could be in this virtualized state for several hours, several days, several weeks even, as that server is being wiped clean. And whenever you're ready, you migrate that data back, they get you back to not where you were when that scary red screen popped up, right? Back to where you were whenever you wanted to start that restoration. And this also gives the ability to combat the criminals in another way. What we are seeing a shift to is even a little scarier with the ransomware, where these criminals will get in and they will steal some data, and they will try to control some of your systems. And then at the end, whenever they've gotten what they want, they detonate one of these ransomware attacks. So now, okay, we just got hit with ransomware. What's the first thing we do? Well, we're going to wipe that encrypted server clean. It's not worth anything. Well, now you've just eliminated all their evidence of all the different scary things they've done. In a virtualized state, it allows you to go in and do some forensics on that machine that was impacted to see if anything had occurred, right? So this gives you some of those abilities. So the benefits are pretty clear. You're going to reduce that downtime. Now you're talking about minutes or hours as opposed to days or weeks to get back up. Before you even start that restoration, let's just get you back up and running. Because again, that's the big piece of leverage they have. All right. Next is you're going to be able to answer those RTO and RPO questions, right? What is my RPO? Well, here's how often I'm taking my backups. What's my RTO? Well, I've never done a disaster test, so I don't know what it is. This gives you the ability to answer those questions and make sure they're aggressive enough for you. And then you have the ability to do that locally or from the cloud. I mean, the big test for us at Data was Hurricane Sandy. We're right on Long Island Sound. We had thousands of clients in the Northeast that were living out of our data centers, working out of our data centers as their server rooms were being drained out, new racks were being put in. How many of those businesses would have been able to survive being down for several weeks or longer, right? And at the end of the day, we were able to put out a statement that said, at the end of the day, we didn't lose a single piece of data from anyone impacted by Hurricane Sandy. The hurricanes that hit a few years ago, we've got a disaster response team that actually drove trucks with equipment down into the storms, into Florida and Texas, to try to make sure we had companies up and running. That's the way that these companies were able to survive, right? So that can go for natural disasters, hardware failures, or these attacks. The obvious reason that we're trying to do this is to take away both pieces of leverage, right? That lost data that they have, right? You can take care of that side, but also the downtime, the most important piece here. Make sure you can keep your operations up and running into a true production environment throughout any one of these attacks. All right, so we're going to open it up to a couple questions. There's a chat box here. You can enter them in, and they've got a couple coming in here. We could kind of go back and forth, but the first one that's coming in is actually about security, which is a good question. It's usually one of the first ones that come up. How secure is the cloud? And I get that a lot of people are kind of worried about the word cloud. But again, that goes back to the fact that we've got our own private data centers. We're not using third-party public data centers. So our data is encrypted in transit and at rest, military-grade encryption on the way and the way up. So, and when it's there. So we have SOC 2 reports. If anybody needs that for compliance issues, we could obviously get to that as well. There's another question coming in. What protects the appliance from the same ransomware that could lock me out of my Windows servers? Tom, do you want to take a stab at that, and we can kind of go back and forth on that one?
Yeah, I've got John here with me. John, maybe you could address that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that kind of protect the appliance as opposed to the Windows server. So one of the big things is that the data appliances don't actually run Windows. So they're protected from all of most of the malware that's going to infect a Windows computer is not going to simultaneously impact a Linux-based appliance of any sort. The other protections that are in place have to do with the security at the file system level on the Linux appliance itself. So it actually has more in the way of base level security. The Datto application, the actual core operating system, is isolated and is not able to execute code from the outside. So those are some of the protections that are built in into the Datto hardware directly.
That's great. Another question is coming in about RTO. How do I figure out what my RTO is with what I'm using now? I guess I'll turn that back over to you guys. I mean, when you go in, how do you start to address that? Is that through a network assessment? How do you start to try to answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly. It really comes from a holistic discovery and a survey with the client. But generally speaking, in the mid-sized businesses, people really haven't considered it, and so it really is a new topic and very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I don't see anyone coming in, but I do want to ask you, I guess, I mean, what do you do in terms of the companies you're working with on the training side of things? How often you do it? What do you go about doing on the training side? I know we talked about how important that is.
We're talking about social engineering training. So,
yeah,
we have got relationships with really the top end Gartner products out there, and we help our clients by bringing those forth so that they can do the type of testing that you described that Datto does, where at any given time you might be testing your employees with a phishing attempt and then using whatever the outcome for an educational process. I mean, that's if an organization isn't doing that, they will be soon, because this is kind of running rampant.
Yeah, it's funny. I was at a presentation last week, and somebody said, well, what are the chances that I'm going to get attacked? this year. I said 100%. You're being attacked. It's whether if they're going to get in or not, but every single business is being attacked. So again, it comes down to training and all the rest and understanding what's out there. And there's some great training tools, and obviously you're a great resource for that as well. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in, and I know a lot of folks don't necessarily want to ask a question on a webinar, so I think it's important to reach back out. I think, you know, you have Agnes's contact information. I mean, my suggestion would be to get a network set, get a second set of eyes onto whatever you're using to make sure that your RPO and your RTO is aggressive enough. Take a look at whether there's any vulnerabilities. I think that would be a great next step, just to, maybe you are protected, but you don't know until somebody comes in and does that. I guess, Tom or John, do you have any other parting words?
You know, Mike, just thank you so much for taking your time today to share this with our prospective clients and existing clients, and the fact that we recorded this, I think, will bring value to a lot of people. So thanks again.
Absolutely, anytime, and you know, look forward to doing more. And everybody, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.